Greetings, y'all. In this next video, I'm going to go over more information about the actual application process, as well as some of the details that I found would be the most valuable to add into our overall workflow. So to get started, I'm going to start off going over the different stages that we can consider for setting up a grants program that can be pretty easy to manage inside of a CRM, allow us to track all the different documents that are required, make sure that we have the right security settings for the sake of privacy, while also being able to ensure that it's as smooth as and effective in the process as possible. That way we don't have like any bottlenecks or fall behind on timelines or, even worse, potentially misinformation. So to start off with, of course, we have the application. In the second part of this video, I'll go into more detail about what components are involved with the application. But obviously, the very first step is going to be having a participant fill out the application to completion so that way it can be assessed. The second stage is an internal review. Now, this stage, typically products are offering about 2 weeks time before getting a response back. I think it'd be very cool if we're able to offer, maybe even give a 2 week expectation, but have a system efficient enough that we can send responses back closer to 7 days. Let's track how well we're able to process grant applications and get them out sooner. The reason is because from a developer or an applicant standpoint, they're really looking at how quickly will they be able to get feedback. One of the other components to this is that we want to make sure that we already have an understanding of who's going to be involved and what are the expectations from them in terms of our internal team. So do we need to get, what role does the compliance officer play? What role does we need to get the CTO involved for integrations expertise? And we need to talk to the marketing team to discuss what types of co-marketing might we be doing in this, as well as whatever stakeholders, investors, CFO. I'm not sure the exact organizational structure that we have here at Neon Labs yet. At the same time, this is one of those processes that we can really streamline quite a bit by making sure that we front load the process in the application workflow. So I'll go into, like I said, in the next section, it's going to be very, very comprehensive to make sure that we have as much information as possible to make an effective decision. But it is something where I think the speed of response is going to make a huge impact of how we can flex the, not expertise, but the superiority of our program over others a developer may be considering. But next is going to be the decision. So in the decision phase, this is something where we either decide that an applicant can proceed and we can begin rolling out the milestones, that an applicant was rejected and we can provide reasons why, or an applicant needs to provide some more information. So that way we're able to perform further due diligence. In this case here, the only main note that I wanted to provide is that it's very important that we showcase and communicate that we're going to give feedback to an applicant, whether they get rejected or approved. That's very important. So that way applicants don't feel like they're potentially wasting their time in setting up an application. Now, ideally, they actually get approved. We find value in their application and they pass due diligence and compliance. Now, whatever compliance and regulatory requirements there are, that's definitely going to be the role of a legal professional to be able to put together. What I would suggest is that whatever those specifications, requirements, limitations might be, we should be transparent so that way a person is able to pre-qualify themselves before even filling out the application. That's going to save us a bunch of time on the back end. So that way we can perform whatever necessary duties we are, whether that's identity management or identity proof, or maybe that's going to come down to location, obviously because every geographic area has their own regulations. Now, once we actually get started with a grant program, this is where things ideally are being processed through a CRM, because I could see how things could get very messy very quickly if we don't have some type of a reliable, organized structure. So within the milestones, we want to make sure that it's very clear, very explicit, in the nature of Rust, exactly what we expect for projects to provide, as well as what kind of a review process do we need to take for those milestones. So if there's a particular tech stack that's being used, we'd want to make sure we know already who on our team is going to be assessing that they already have it earmarked that in a blank period of time, maybe it's a 3 week in between each milestone expectation, or for really big projects, maybe it's like a 6 week kind of time period. The point is, we should have this planned out in the beginning stages, so that way then a person on the team is able to have this already on their radar, ideally connected to a CRM that's tied to their calendar, so that way there's complete transparency so we can collaborate much more easily. Now, once the applicant, we'll go on to the next stage, once they've completed the milestones, we'll want to ensure that we're able to analyze those appropriately. You know what, real quick, I'm going to go back to the milestone start because I did forget something very important. At the milestone start component, we want to make sure that at this stage, we have a physical meeting on Zoom or something to go over all of the expectations with the grant participant. So that way, from our internal standpoint, we have consensus on exactly what we're expecting. And on top of that, we have agreements with the other party. So that way we can ensure that everybody is on the same page. And these recordings should be saved in the CRM. So that way they can be referenced for if there's any confusion that happens in the future. So once they've actually gone and we've officially started, we've got the timelines worked out, we know what the roles and responsibilities of each party is, then they're going to complete the delivery. At that point, we would have whoever's involved to assess and make sure that everything works properly. We will be laying out the specifications required. So this would be usually having the system Dockerized. So that way, then we can test the components on our side. Usually this also requires, some type of a video demonstration of the component that they're putting together. And it really depends on the project. If they're doing something like a CLI tool or something like that, it may be that there's not a whole lot to physically see. On the other hand, if it's something like education or a front-end tool, then maybe it's going to be a wireframe or something like that. Every type of project that we might be bringing on will have its own specific set of milestones. And this is exactly what we want to be coming to consensus on in the previous stage. So that way then inside of the CRM, everything is laid out. We know exactly what to be looking for. We know the general timelines to expect it in. And if the participants don't provide the information that's required, then we can already be in a position to simply request more information because they haven't followed through with what's needed. And ideally, it's something where they have completed the milestone successfully, at which case we go back and they begin the next milestone. And of course, this should have complete transparency and be absolutely explicit in what needs to be provided. Finally is when we actually go into the completion stage. Usually at this point, it's something where we want to already have a plan for how are we going to escalate this project to closure. What this might mean is some type of a public presentation. So it might be a demonstration of sorts, showcasing exactly what our grant participant created. This might be some kind of a co-marketing situation. Maybe we do an AMA or a live, or some type of a tutorial that goes through how other people can participate with this. Ideally here, we want to find a way to kill two birds with one stone. So that way we can maximize the amount of value creation that we can receive as a result of the people that we're investing in from the grants program, which finally leads us to closure. This is going to be a matter of transitioning the CRM stages into whatever actions we're going to be completing, closing out the active grant program. So that way then that participant is completed in their system and they've moved on to the next action. Now, ideally here, this is where we want to have some type of a feedback loop to provide us with information on how well did we do as a team and what insights or discoveries, bottlenecks or challenges did we find along this process. That way, with each and every grant program that we go through, we're going to be able to optimize and iterate our systems for continued improvement. Now, for the final section of this video, I want to go into more information about what the actual details that we should be bringing in are, so we can accelerate the overall process of transitioning people through each one of these deal stages. Now, these different components that I broke down, they really come from aggregating each one of the different grant programs that I assessed. And this rabbit hole does go pretty deep. So I'm not going to sit here and read off every single one of them because there's like a dozen, and that's just not going to be a good use of anybody's time. I'll have the link here so that way you can take a look at the Notion document to see everything. So of course, to start out with, we're going to go with the contact details. We need to know who we're talking to, who's the leader. We want to know their information such as social, as well as do they have any type of marketing insights or anything that we can tangibly see. From there, we want to understand their team and their experience so we can understand more of where they're coming from. And that'll help us from a due diligence standpoint to consider how viable do we believe it is that these participants should be able to pull a project off. Finally, we want to go into the initial proposal stage. This is going to include what is the estimated start date and completion date, as well as how much capital are they looking for. This would be a section that's appropriate for them to provide an elevator pitch, a quick 2 or 3 sentence description of exactly what they're wanting. From there, we want to make it to allow us to have as smooth of a process as possible. Ideally, the applicant should be telling us why they think that their thing, whatever it is they're going to provide, is going to be a fit for our ecosystem. So there's a couple of questions that we can list out. Everything from who's your target audience, how is this a fit in the Neon Labs ecosystem, and then what solutions are similar to what they're already building. Now, of course, some people like to think that their project is completely novel and unique, but we all know that if somebody is doing something, there's probably a similar project that's occurring somewhere in the ecosystem. There's just only so many ways to build things. The reason why this question is super useful is because that can help us to be able to set something of a standard or set the bar for what should we be expecting. Next, we want to go into the product details. There's going to be information such as the technology stack, documentation, proof of concept, data models, mockups, or any other types of tangible details that we can assess to get an idea of what are some appropriate expectations that we can set when it comes to setting up different milestones. One of the details that I liked a lot from another program was to actually request what are some project limitations. Specifically, what is it that we want to have the applicant thinking about? What can their project not do as a result of the grant program? Meaning that we know it's a limited time period that they're going to be building this thing. Maybe it's 3 weeks, maybe it's 6 weeks, maybe it's 3 months. It really just depends on the complexity. But by making it to where the burden of discussing what should we not be expecting from this allows us to be able to accelerate the due diligence process, because we'll have a better idea of what they're not able to do, which tells us a lot about their mindset, their capabilities, while also making it to where the applicant really needs to be thinking through what can they provide to make sure things aren't being overpromised. Next, we want to be able to understand the current traction. What are they actually working on? Have they done any other previous grants before? Overall, what kind of a time commitment would they expect? This will help us to understand if the use of funds makes sense. Ideally, we'd like to have someone who's participated in a hackathon or some other type of competition. And if they have any kind of marketing materials, such as social media, blogs, video demonstrations, anything like that, that would be optimal to be able to showcase. So that way we can understand where they're coming from. This next section on the target deliverables is going to be something that, of course, there's a whole lot of ways this can be interpreted. Ideally, we come together as a team to be able to figure out what the best ways are to come up with how we can assess the level of effectiveness that they're having in putting things together. So this would include, what are the deliverables? What are the milestones? What are the timelines expected for this? How do we actually verify and test that whatever it is they're providing actually works? So of course, if it's something like a front-end project, it's going to be pretty easy. Can we see it, touch it, and does the thing work properly? On the other hand, if it's something a bit more low level, then that's going to require some level of testing. Maybe we need to have everything packaged up into a Docker container. They're probably going to have to write documentation for us so we can replicate their solution on our side. But this is the point where we want the grant applicant to be telling us what they think would be an appropriate amount. Once again, so that way we can limit the amount of due diligence time required on our side. Obviously, if whatever they submit isn't acceptable for us, we can provide feedback to them. Alternatively, ideally, these are pretty smart people that we're working with, so they're going to hopefully be able to provide the information that showcases what they're trying to build and what they see, and if it's acceptable for us, we can proceed forward. Now, this final stage, not final stage, excuse me, but this next stage, probably the one I'm most excited about and part that I have the most experience with, is the use of funds. So this is something that I happen to come from a background of finance. So I'm familiar with putting together different types of financial statements, but most developers aren't. So it's something where in this section, what we can do to really help developers out is provide examples of what are we expecting in terms of how the funds are being used. Are we looking for the market rates per hour, what the developers are providing? Are we looking to understand a comparable analysis? What would this cost to set up from a third party or a consulting firm or a contract firm? Use of funds may also include whatever technology is being used. If there's some kind of cloud systems involved, even something like a heavy data indexing process can cost $8,000 to $14,000 per month, depending on the amount of data being processed. So by being able to give examples, something tangible that's kind of like a bullet list that developers or project builders can look at, we can help to guide them to give us as effective of a use of funds as possible. On top of that, this is where a conversation would definitely be warranted with our financial officer and compliance officer. So that way we can better understand what do we need from a regulatory standpoint to ensure that the system stays above board. Because obviously, as we're scaling this out, we're going to want to move towards as much as much transparency as possible, since we are moving towards being a decentralized organization. So it's something where the idea here is that most projects, from what I found, they do a terrible job of requesting how the use of funds goes. And this makes for a pretty big bottleneck for applicants because it creates a bit of anxiety and hesitation. And if it's pretty far in the application process that they find this, I'm guessing that more often than not, grant programs face some pretty poor results in terms of what projects provide. So we can help accelerate that process by simply being explicit. Next is going to be co-marketing and social media. Let's ask them what they're looking for. This is one of those examples where we can find out early on how could this project integrate within our ecosystem and what value, in addition to the solution that they're providing, can we showcase as a result of participating with them. And then finally, the last two sections would include payment details and then any kind of tax or legal requirements that we'll need to do for the sake of regulations. Now, the payment details, usually what projects are doing is they offer either stablecoin or a native token, and they have their wallets submitted up front. This is useful because if they submit a wallet up front, while sure, most developers are going to provide a brand new wallet that hasn't been touched yet, but if they send us a wallet that already has, that gives us more information to do due diligence and find out more about this person, see what type of activity are they participating in, and to make sure that from a risk standpoint, we're mitigating our risk as much as possible. So I know that this was a pretty dense video. Definitely check out the notes for more information. The next video is probably one of the most exciting here, and that's going to be me walking through the full pre-built, I say pre-built, but I built it already, but the full system of what we can use to be able to deploy a grant program as soon as possible. So that way, whenever we begin having discussions, we can get right into the nitty-gritty and find out how can we create the best grant management system possible, given whatever limited resources that we may have, so we can be as efficient and effective as possible. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. Until next time, bye for now.